everybody, it's Drybear. Something that I didn't think was possible to happen, at least in the short term, has finally happened, and that is Dungeonborn, another entry in the Dark and Darker style genre of game, has overtaken Dark and Darker on Steam. Now, the games are similar enough where this could just be a recency bias. Just having the new shiny toy to play is something different. Maybe there's a lot of hardcore Dark and Darker fans that have been playing Dark and Darker even when they were off Steam for a long time, and they just want something new, different classes, different items, different maps, different content, something new and fresh to mix things up. You can see since the launch of Dungeonborn last week, it's been fighting for control over with Dark and Darker as far as the daily active users go, and as it goes higher and higher, it actually ended up surpassing Dark and Darker just about Sunday is when it kind of overtook it. They've been kind of tying back and forth, but for the last few days or so, Dungeonborn has been sitting at a higher peak and a higher overall average than Dark and Darker as far as active players go. So why is that? Why are players picking up Dungeonborn and having a good time? And also I noticed when I first started making content for Dungeonborn versus Dark and Darker, there's also a little bit of a protectiveness that goes over Dark and Darker. Some players feel threatened by Dungeonborn. They feel like Dungeonborn is just a inferior product, but the numbers say otherwise. So let's talk about what there might be between the two games that might make one or the other an interesting choice for different people. Now, undoubtedly, Dark and Darker just has more content as it stands right now. They have more maps, they have more classes. The classes in Dark and Darker are more fleshed out. You can actually make full customized builds. When Dungeonborn was in its early playtesting state, and even in the final playtest before they went live, they had a fixed number of abilities, 2 for every single class in the game, which meant that every class had a Q and an E, and you couldn't change them, and you had some passive stat benefits you could get from gaining gear. But in Dark and Darker, that's not true. You have a large list of abilities that you can slot in and out. There's a full list of spells that you can do on different casters that you can put in your spell book and your memory slots, combine those together. You have different interaction points in the game, but I think it is worth mentioning that the game progression that Dark and Darker has made as far as development goes over the first year or two of their development was greatly stunted because of the lawsuit and legal restrictions that they were under. They spent a large amount of overhead, administrative efforts, and focus trying to fight the lawsuit that they were in, rather than just making the game better and focusing on improving. And I think that regardless of whether you like Dark and Darker more than Dungeonborn or Dungeonborn more than Dark and Darker, I think we finally have a moment now where Dark and Darker actually has a viable competitor. And honestly, I think that's only good things for both games. I think that they both become better games because there's another option out there. I think that the changes that Dungeonborn made going into launch were likely because of the competition between them and Dark and Darker. They went free to play at the last moment outside of their playtest. They also started adding more skills to their classes before launch in worries that their comparison to the free-to-play Dark and Darker wouldn't be as favorable and might limit people from playing their game. On top of that, it seems like Dark and Darker is starting to pick up a little bit more content engagement, trying to add more loot drops, which was a big discussion point for the community in Dark and Darker for a while, and even having different options being added to the game to make Dark and Darker a better experience now that there finally is another kingpin to contend with. But is there something about Dungeonborn that's making it peak at a higher active users right now than is with the Dark and Darker experience? Even though Dark and Darker has more content, Dungeonborn is newer, which is always going to have a nice little edge up in the recency bias, and we're only inside of the 1 week bonus, like the first week launch of Dungeonborn. So what does that mean between the two? I think that the biggest leg up that Dungeonborn has on Dark and Darker, at least in my perspective, is going to be performance and overall fluidity of the game itself. I think Dungeonborn is a lot more sound as a piece of software. It launches better, it loads better. It has tons of issues, I won't lie about that, but I have far less issues playing Dungeonborn as far as like the interacting with the piece of software that it is than I do in Dark and Darker. And there's also a laundry list of quality of life things that exist in Dungeonborn that I wish existed in Dark and Darker. Cleaning up the inventory, having a global currency amount, so I'm not hoarding around bags of gold. I know that there's a nice hardcore aspect to Dark and Darker's kind of gritty and dark aesthetic, and the hoops it makes you jump through to play the game, how you have to fight with your inventory, you have to fight with the gold, and you have to figure out how to combine them into higher and higher bags, and how to trade with other people, and risking it all for going down into the lower levels, or even going into PvP modes when you find people on the levels, whether you're playing solo or group. But I do actually find it refreshing to have more quality of life and more polish overall in Dungeonborn. The PvP overall feels mostly the same to me in Dungeonborn versus Dark and Darker, though I will note that Dungeonborn feels a little bit faster, and I'm not sure yet if that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to the Dark and Darker PvP combat. Honestly, in some cases it's a good thing, in some cases it feels like a bad thing, and sometimes when you're fighting other players in Dungeonborn, it feels like it could be over in a flash, and this is true in some encounters with Dark and Darker, especially when you have like high roller status and everyone's really geared out. But in general, I find that there's a lot more boxing going on in Dark and Darker when there's PvP going on. I will often have very extended combat encounters in Dark and Darker where it feels like a little bit like we're playing chess and we're trying to use the environment, use the doors, use the way around, and use the enemies around us to fight each other. Whereas in Dungeonborn, it feels like it's much more snappy and almost like MMO PvP, where it's like you're in an arena duking it out for who is the best. And I actually haven't decided yet which one I like more. I think overall, I probably like the Dark and Darker PvP better, but I like Dungeonborn as an experience overall more. And so I think that kind of disparity is where we're going to find the best game in between the both of them. And I asked the question to you, which one do you like more? Have you tried both? Have you played Dungeonborn? Have you played Dark and Darker? And what do you think about the two? Do you think that one has an edge over the other? And how would you explain the recent rise of Dungeonborn to overtake Dark and Darker as an option on Steam for people that are playing? Because honestly, the biggest takeaway I have from this is that I actually end up enjoying both games, and the number one thing I want to see from both of them is content. I want to see a lot more classes, a lot more maps, a lot more encounters, more boss fights, more items, more. And I want to see these games grow quickly, because I feel like there's not a lot of competition. It seems like these are the only two that exist in the genre. A lot of the other ones, like Greed is Good and some of these other like extraction fantasy RPG style games, either just didn't ship or had troubles in development, that sort of thing. So it's nice to see that we actually have, number one, Dark and Darker on Steam now finally, and number two, we have an actual competitor for both of them so that they can work to make each other better, and you can have conversations about both games on both sides, or you maybe even could jump in one, have some fun, jump in the other, experience all the different content that exists in the other, and go back and forth and enjoy both of them for what they are. But of course, let me know what you think down below. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.